Hello everyone, this is Al Spectra. Welcome back to the Land of Empires. And today I want to record episode 5 of my Apex Arena review series. Now, before we dive into the review, I want to spend a little time going over actual Season 7 compositions. Now, I've been holding off on making kind of a Season 7 guide for a while now because Season 7 mechanics are just not very well understood, especially with how heroes such as Leona work. Leona, what she can do is she can confer a lot of tankiness to the infantry. And based on her skill descriptions, that tankiness is never really understood. And how the season 7 meta kind of evolved was basically from trial and error. People were testing different arma as well as different hero combinations between season 7 and other season heroes. And after a while, we just ended up with kind of a list of what worked, what didn't work, what compositions countered other compositions, and how they can be countered themselves. So I will share with you kind of a portion of that list today. I do not believe even I have a comprehensive list of all the composition counters, but one benefit to that, I would say, is that there is not a single composition within season 7 that significantly stands out from the rest. And this means that every composition within season 7 can be countered, whether that is solo or within a rally setup. So I'm going to start by reviewing the most popular season 7 teams outside of the battle disorder. And after this, I will review the most popular compositions within the battle disorder. So starting out with the classic season 7 setup, I will call the arma variations whenever the hero is equipped with arma. So I have requested for the devs to actually show the arma within this menu interface, but it looks like we'll have to wait on that for a bit. So starting off with probably the most stable and most popular season 7 composition, and that is Neptunarch, Dorothy, and Lisbeth with Horn God's arma. So you have Lisbeth with the season 6 arma. And the reason why we use Lisbeth instead is due to her passive skill, which confers a damage down to your enemy attacks. Within this composition, you would like to run mostly infantry, because if you were going against a mirror composition where your opponent is running Neptunarch and the same composition as you, his Neptunarch will be able to wipe out your knight and archer, your cavalry and archer, almost immediately. And this is really why you do not want to run too many cavalry and archers, because they will just simply die once Neptunarch unleashes his ultimate attack. So the composition is mostly infantry and enough archer and knights to kind of fend off against variations. A variation of this composition is Neptunarch with Michael's arma. When you are running that setup, you are starting to rely more on cavalry damage. So if you are running Neptunarch with Michael's arma, I would run more cavalry, maybe like 60 to 70,000 cavalry. And this will allow your cavalry to survive long enough to deal a lot of damage. And the reason why the cavalry doesn't die is because of the Michael effect. And Michael's ultimate will suppress your opponent's Neptunarch rage skill damage significantly, this preventing him from killing your own cavalry. So you will allow enough time for your cavalry to survive to continuously suppress your opponent's Neptunarch, because remember, the cavalry's rage skill confers a negative 70% charge speed, or was it negative 90%? I kind of forget, to your opponent frontline rage skill charge speed. So your Dorothy will be doing a lot of the damage. However, if your stats are not high enough, your enemy's Neptunarch will still be doing a lot of damage to your own Neptunarch, because Neptunarch just deals more damage than Michael. So this is a popular variation, and it can kind of soft counter the default Neptunarch, Dorothy, and Lisbeth with Horn God's arma, but I would say it has a slight edge over that composition. Another variation is Neptunarch with Kellerman's arma. Now, some people have made that variation work against either the naive variation, as I mentioned at the start, or the Kellerman variation. Or the Michael variation. So if you were to run that variation, I would probably once again run mostly infantry. Now, the next popular composition is what looks to be 777, meaning all season 7 heroes. However, 777 is actually not a proper composition. The real composition is equipping Michael's arma on Neptunarch. So you essentially have Michael, Dorothy, and Leona. And once again, Dorothy confers a lot of tankiness to your infantry, and so this composition relies on Leona to deal the damage, while not having the weakness of a composition I'll cover in the future, which is replacing Dorothy with Morgan. So this composition, it is very good against this composition, and the reason for that is that Leona is pretty much uninhibited. With Michael on your Neptunarch, you are able to suppress your opponent's Michael's rage skill damage, and so he cannot easily handle your Leona. And after 15 seconds, Leona gains a further buff from the cavalry passive skills, and so she becomes quite tanky after a while. So this composition is very good against this composition, but be sure to equip Michael's arma on Neptunarch, because if you don't, this is not a real composition. It will lose to a lot of different compositions. So in terms of troop setup, we have low cavalry count, because cavalry is literally just there to provide tankiness to Neptunarch using Michael's arma, and to provide some passive tankiness to Leona. The archer is there for the bulk of the damage, but you do not want the infantry to die quickly enough. And the archer is tanky enough in this scenario that you don't really need to use too many. So this is the composition I would go with if I were to run this hero lineup. The next popular lineup is Kellerman with a Frost arma, Dorothy, and Lisbeth with Horn God's arma. So this is kind of an old classic composition from before Leona got buffed. I would say this composition handles the default 776 quite well. And yeah, some people just run this, but I personally feel that this composition is better within a rally setup. And I think it performs quite well in rallies. However, it is fairly weak to Leona. So versus non-Leona, this composition is quite good, I think, against this composition or armor variations of this composition. But if you see your opponent running Leona, this composition kind of falls short, especially with Dorothy. Dorothy, Leona, and Neptunarch with Michael's arma. So if you are running this composition, of course, bring mostly infantry, because the infantry is the one doing the damage. The archer is just there to provide the passive, and so is the cavalry. Now the next composition has only arisen after Leona received 2 rounds of buffs. And these are buffing not only her survivability, but also her damage. And this composition actually arose as primarily a counter towards one of the most popular compositions in Season 7, which is Neptunarch with Michael's arma, Dorothy, and Leona. And this composition almost hard counters this composition simply due to the fact that Morgan allows Leona to spam her ultimate much more quickly than Dorothy does. Because keep in mind, Dorothy's rage skill only hampers the front line rage skill charge speed. It doesn't hamper Leona's charge speed. So Dorothy can do nothing against Leona besides kind of tickle her with her passive damage. So what happens is that Leona will pretty much murder the front line of this composition. She will murder Neptunarch using Michael's armor, because Michael doesn't suppress Leona either. It only suppresses the front line. It will murder Dorothy. And with the front line gone, Leona is as good as dead. And so the key towards this composition is to keep Michael alive long enough for Leona to do her damage. And this is why in most scenarios, you do not really want to use more Leona troops, more archer troops than you would infantry. Typically, I would keep infantry troops at a higher count than the archer. And the reason for that is that Michael is much more vulnerable towards infantry as well as cavalry attacks compared to if you had ran Dorothy. Because remember, Dorothy confers a lot of defensive power to your infantry, whereas Morgan is just Morgan. He is still kind of the default season 4 cavalry. He will not protect your Michael. So your Michael will be receiving a lot of damage, not only from normal attacks, but also from rage skills. But as long as you keep Michael alive long enough, Leona will absolutely crush this composition. Now, one thing to note is that this composition does get countered by this composition if they are running more archer and cavalry. If they are running too few archer and cavalry, what will happen is that the archer and cavalry will actually get killed by Leona fairly quickly. And Neptunarch alone cannot really handle the onslaught of Leona before being able to kill Michael. So if you are facing, say, 776 or 576, the armor variation, then you can run this composition. Well, of course, I would prefer if you ran this composition because it is a sure win. But if you were to running this composition, then you can check how many archer and cavalry your opponent is running. If they are running a decent amount of archers and cavalry, you will lose almost guaranteed. But if they are running, say, a very conservative number, I know this is a number that some people really like to run, then you might even be able to win with this composition. So that is all the basic compositions I wanted to cover for clashes outside of the Battle of Disorder. I guess one final composition I can quickly mention is kind of a Season 6 and Season 6 variation. So we have the classic Season 6 composition, which was most powerful back when we were in Season 6. And that was Kellerman with Frost Arma, Chitaurian, which is the Season 6 Cavalry, and Horn God. And in this composition, you would typically run very few archer, very few cavalry, and mostly infantry. However, in the context of Season 7, you do not want to run mostly infantry. You kind of want to run a mix of infantry and cavalry. And cavalry actually is very powerful in Season 7 combinations because for some reason, the tankiness of the infantry completely loses its efficacy in front of either Leona or Dorothy. So running pure infantry will just get yourself massacred by either this composition or even this composition. It will get you massacred by all compositions. Of course, even if you run cavalry, this is kind of a Season 6 composition, so it will get massacred anyways. But if you want to deal even the slightest damage to your opponent, you can run either Hanzo or Horn God as the archer. There are some differences, but the differences are not critical, I would say, unless you are at the min-max level. I would run enough cavalry to be able to damage either the backline, either the opponent cavalry or the opponent archer. And I can kind of show a quick example from the Arena of Legends. Whoops, not here. So, for example, one way I was able to counter Raikkonen here, which admittedly is a bit weaker than me, is I see that he is running very low cavalry and infantry, cavalry and archer, only 20,000 cavalry and 5,000 archer. So when your opponent is running such low quantities of especially archer, you can actually kill those two units with your Season 6 cavalry. So it would be even more effective had I used Hanzo instead of Horn God, because remember, Horn God's passive skill confers a 50% damage down, or even higher, I think a 65% damage down to your team at the start, at the first 15 seconds of the battle. So what happens here is that Chitaurian, the Season 6 cavalry, is actually able to kill the archer and cavalry of this classic Season 7 combination. And you can see, although the damage is not significant, it is sufficient to kill, to accomplish the job. This composition will not be able to damage the infantry at all. And this is really characteristic of Dorothy's buff that is not in her skill description. I don't know how Dorothy works, but she just makes the infantry so invincible. But the team has done its job. And your next team can kill the infantry for free because it is not supported by Dorothy nor Lisbeth with Horn God's Arma. And so the rest is a very easy win. So that is kind of like the tricks you can do in season 7. I know a lot of people enjoy season 7 much more than the previous seasons, and that is especially due to the fact that every single season 7 composition has at least a soft counter. There is not a single composition that really dominates all other compositions. And when it comes to flag play, what you can do, let me go to a flag. It is actually quite difficult to solo rally a flag in season 7. And this is because your opponent can introduce 2 different defender teams. They can introduce a classic 7-7-6 defender and another 5-4-7 defender, for example. And if you were to run a team that counters the 7-7-6, your enemy could be checking this menu. The moment your rally launches, they will see that incoming attack within this menu, and they can quickly switch out the main defender. And this is a much better improvement compared to how defending worked in the past, where the player with the highest march power was the main defender, no matter what you tried to do. Like, he could be at the end of the defending list, and he would just completely take over the defense, and you would get absolutely raped. So this is really spicing up the combat as of late. Not only does every team has their own respective counters, but there's also a lot of dynamics towards switching out defender teams, as well as rallying the towers. Because nowadays you have to do like double rallies in order to confuse your opponent and make it harder for them to adjust the defender team to counter your incoming attack. So now I'll switch pace a little bit and start talking about the Battle of Disorder compositions. Now there are three primary teams in the Battle of Disorder. And the first team, I hope I can do this quickly enough, but the first team is Kellerman without any arma. So Kellerman without any arma, Dorothy and Lisbeth with Horn God's arma. And typically what people would run in this team is low archer, a decent amount of cavalry. And the strength of the cavalry is really key in this team. So you want to run a decent amount of cavalry, but not too many. And the rest being infantry. The stronger your cavalry is, the stronger this team will be. If your cavalry is too weak, then your opponent can kind of counter this team by using Kellerman with frost armor. So if they use Kellerman with frost armor, they can run a lower amount of cavalry compared to you, mostly infantry, and your cavalry will not be able to deal enough damage to them before you just die. So it can be suppressed slightly if your cavalry is weak, but otherwise, this is probably the most dominant composition in the Battle of Disorder. The other composition, as I mentioned earlier, is equipping Kellerman with frost armor. Although that composition has been popular in the past, that composition unfortunately gets kind of countered by this composition. Your enemy can run low infantry and heavy archer. And this is kind of the difference between the Battle of Disorder and fights outside of the Battle of Disorder. Whenever you're fighting outside of the Battle of Disorder, you typically do not want to run too few infantry. But within the Battle of Disorder, you don't really have too big of a tankiness difference between the infantry and the archer. And so you can afford to run fewer infantry and stack up mostly on your archer. So this composition is very potent against this composition with Kellerman with frost armor. It'll absolutely, I wouldn't say absolutely massacre, because nothing really absolutely massacres compositions in the Battle of Disorder. Stats are just way more balanced. But yeah, this composition is probably the second most composition in the Battle of Disorder. Of course, I am showing Morgan here, but you can also use Quinn with Morgan armor. And yeah, this composition you can either run 1-to-1 infantry cavalry, 1-to-1 infantry archer. That is pretty popular. And you can also run low infantry, high archer. So test it out yourself. Although this composition, people mostly run archer, there are variations where your performance would depend on what your opponent is running towards you. Now, the third and final popular composition is Kellerman. Well, I wouldn't say Kellerman, but an armor variation of Kellerman. So whoever among these heroes, besides Michael, because you want to use Michael together with Leona, is equipped with Kellerman's armor. So I'm just going to use Horus as an example here. So Horus, whoever is equipping Morgan's armor, I would say Quinn, but I'm just going to show Morgan. And finally, Horn God. So you never really want to use the respective heroes that actually does the job. And the concept behind this composition is that you want your Kellerman to spam his ultimate skill. And this arm is very powerful in the Battle Disorder. So if you allow your Kellerman to spam the rage skill, then your Kellerman will disarm your opponent pretty much very effectively. And one thing that people have noticed is that Leona actually does get disarmed in the Battle Disorder. So if I'm incorrect on that, please correct me. But this composition is very powerful. It is actually a soft counter against this composition. But unfortunately, this composition does get countered. The composition I showed earlier does get countered by this classic most powerful composition, whether it's Kellerman himself or Kellerman running Frost Arma. Okay. And really the power behind the third composition is the armor variations. You can switch that composition across all of your different heroes. You can run any hero equipped with Kellerman's armor, any cavalry equipped with Morgan's armor. It could be anything. And finally, any archer equipped with Horn God's armor. So you could run this composition forever for the rest of your fights once your team 1 and 2s run out of energy. And the troop setup for this composition would typically be low cavalry, so you could put 5,000 or 10,000. Whoops. Yeah, whatever. A fair amount of archers. I wouldn't put too many. Just enough archers to confer that defensive rage skill buff towards your infantry. Otherwise, your infantry will start taking a lot of damage. And finally, the rest towards your infantry. So that is just very powerful, not only because of it being able to counter this composition, but also because you can switch that armor variation across all of your heroes. So essentially that allows you to fight in a battle disorder for a very, very long time, especially against strong alliances where both sides are exhausted, meaning that they have ran out of energy on their main team. You can run that composition against the rest of their teams and fight on that way. So this is how people are starting to gain over 5 billion or even 6-7 billion merits in the Battle Disorder. And yeah, it allows you to fight forever as long as you are strong. Because as everyone knows now, the hero energy never really runs out. So I think this video has been a little too long. I was originally planning to review the Apex Arena, but I think I'll leave this for the next video. So I hope everyone enjoyed this video, and I'll see everyone in my next video, which hopefully will be an Apex Arena review.